I want to build custom furniture for a living, but I have no clients yet. I also don't really have a good enough workshop to work to the standard that I want to, so let's fix that. The first project I want to build is a workbench. I would use a hardwood like beech for this, but wood is expensive, so I just went with some standard construction lumber. This means I will be putting a lot more dents in the workbench as time goes on, but better the bench than whatever furniture I'm building. So let's get into the build. I'm using 2x6 boards here, and why I'm using those is gonna become pretty apparent later. But for now, I'm just going to cut some material off the sides, so I don't have to do as much planing later. I don't have an outfit table on my table saw, so I almost dropped the board here. So I don't hurt myself, I decide to use my Mitre Saw station as an outfit table. Actually, quite a bit of time passed since that last clip. I discovered that because I bought treated wood, it was still pretty wet. I stacked all the boards in my greenhouse and left them there to dry for 2 months. Now the wood is at around 10% and I can keep working with it. This is a symbol that I learned in school. You put it on the edge you just jointed, so you always know what side to reference when putting the board through the thicknesser. Now it's gonna become pretty apparent why we're using 2x6 boards. By layering 3 of them together, we get an easy tenant without too much work. When gluing up boards like this, I like to lay them all next to each other, so I can just apply glue across the whole thing with a roller. I am applying a bit too much glue on one joint as I'm putting them together, but you could just only lay 2 boards there instead of all 3 of them, and then you wouldn't have the extra glue joint. Since all the boards are the same thickness, that gives me the final dimensions for the width of the leg. So if the boards are 4 cm each, my leg is 12 cm by 12 cm. It is important that I do not remove any material from the thickness of the boards, now that it is glued up, as this would leave the tenons misaligned. To make sure that the workbench does not wobble at the end, I need to make sure that all 4 legs are the same length. To do this, I first take the leg to the table saw and cut the bottom off. Since my blade can't cut material this thick, I have to take 2 passes at it, by turning the leg around and cutting again. The shoulder of the tenon is what determines the final height of the table, as that is what the underside of the worktop is going to sit on. Using the depth stop at the miter saw, I can make sure to only cut through one board and leave the tenon fully intact. Then I can simply remove the rest with a handsaw and a chisel. When gluing up the legs, I should have made a cutout in the center board for the mortise. This would have made it so that I only had to cut out 4 mortises instead of 8. I do remember to do this later in the worktop though. Now is probably a good time to show you what we are actually building. It's a pretty basic design with 4 stretchers for the base and then the top attaches with tenons. We got a vise on the face and a Moxon vise on the side and plenty of dog holes all over the bench. This is not the most creative workbench and I copied a lot of elements from Frank's workbench and Nick from Pedula Studio. Both made some great videos on their workbenches which I highly recommend you check out. I'd say this workbench is a bit more advanced than Frank's, but a lot less advanced than Nick's. There are a couple of small things neither of them did that I just personally wanted to add to the bench, but more about that later. After marking all the tenons, I add a triangle on top of the legs. This helps me know where each leg is meant to be when assembling. To have a consistent mortise without too much hassle, I'm going to use a router with a template. The template is pretty easy to make, and here's how. Make sure to remove the riving knife from the table saw, as this will prevent the blade from plunging through the material. Next, measure from the edge of the board to the first edge of the hole you want to make, and set your fence to that same size, making sure to measure from the fence to the right side of the blade. Now you can slowly raise your blade until you fully cut through the marked area. For the second cut, we measure from the same edge of the board to the second line. But this time, when we set the fence, we measure from the fence to the left side of the blade. This will offset your cut by the thickness of the blade. It is better to slowly dial in your cut than to overshoot your measurement. Repeat these steps for the other two sides. I've added two scrap pieces to the side of the template to help align it with the center of the leg. This is what is called a template router bit. The little ring at the base of the router freely spins and rides along the edge of your template. It is perfectly flush with the blades of the bit, letting you copy the exact shape of your template. Making sure not to remove too much material with each pass, as you don't want to overwhelm the little router. If you have a more powerful router and a bigger bit, you can remove more material with each pass. Since I can only reach so far in with the router bit, I removed the rest of the material using a hole saw and a chisel. And here you can see why it is important to not put your tripod on a very wobbly surface. I did not show myself making the 4 stretchers that attach to the legs, as it is basically the same process as making the legs. At the time of me recording this voiceover, the video is already over 50 minutes long, and I really do not want to drag it out any further. What you see me doing here is called a drawbore. Basically what you do is you drill holes through all the mortises, and you dry assemble everything and mark the exact hole location on the tenons using a drill bit or center punch. Now when you drill the holes in the tenons, you offset the hole by 1 to 2 mm towards the shoulder. This has the effect that when you put the dowel through the holes, it pulls the mortise and tenon together, letting you glue the two together without clamps. When drilling the tenons, I actually make the mistake to drill away from the shoulder, which would pull the pieces apart when driving the dowel through. So I had to turn all the boards around and remark the holes. That's why there are 4 holes in each of the tenons instead of 2. Before the glue up, I countersink the holes and sharpen the dowels. This will help align the dowel with the hole when driving it through. Since the holes need to line up correctly, I added some triangles to the stretchers as well, so I don't get confused. Since I don't really need any clamps, the glue up is very straightforward. I just apply glue liberally to both the mortise and tenon, and then apply glue to the dowel so it doesn't come loose over time. Then I just drive the dowel through the hole, which secures the joint together. You can see the glue gets squeezed out of the joint as it gets pulled together. After letting the glue dry, I can cut off the exposed dowels with a flush cut saw and then give it a rough sanding. Some of the boards were so warped after drying that if I had planed them flat, they would have been too small. So what I'm doing instead is arranging the boards in a way that they can counteract each other. Earlier I was talking about the extra glue joint. For the top of the bench, I make sure to apply glue to each side of the boards, as the workbench top needs to be as solid as it can be. And by applying glue to both sides, I can be 100% sure that there's no dry spots on the boards. After planing the glue joints, I can now get to arranging the layout of the workbench. To ensure that the top stays as flat as possible, I arrange the boards with opposing grain directions. What this means is, when you look at the rings at the end of the boards, each one points in the opposite direction of the board next to it. As the wood contracts and expands over the years, the boards counteract each other and it should result in a straight top. I make sure to mark the boards with a big triangle across the face, so I know how to align them later. The 2 boards at the side are going to be glued on last, so I put them aside for now, and I split the top into 3 packages. I do this so I can fit them through my thicknesser once they are glued up, and so I don't have as many glue joints to worry about with each glue up. This time I do remember to cut the boards before the glue up to give me an easy mortise. I can hog out most of the material at the Mitre Saw by making a bunch of cuts and then breaking the pieces out. Then I can just go in with the jigsaw and the chisel to get the rest of the material out. I get a really nice and tight fit here, but that is actually going to bite me in the ass later. When gluing up the bottom, I make sure that the bottom is as flat as possible. And I remove the excess glue from the mortars. I was going to run the packages over my jointer after the glue dried, but they were too heavy for me to joint on my own. So instead I have to hand plane them. And don't be like me. Take it off the pipe clamps so it doesn't roll around while you try to plane it. By going across the grain it helps me even out the boards, and I occasionally check my progress with a square. At the end I check with a large level if everything is flat and if there's any twisting in it. Then I can square up the side, making sure to not touch the side with the mortars, as this would affect the final thickness of it and make the tenon not fit anymore. I actually make a big mistake here, as I'm using a square that I got from a boot market, and as it turns out it is slightly off 90. After cleaning up the mess that hand painting makes, I can now run the blocks through my little thicknesser, and it is working overtime here. This is probably the biggest piece of wood this little guy can handle. If this was oak, I don't know if it wouldn't just break down. To align all the chunks with each other, I made myself a little dowel jig out of some scraps. A little tip if you don't have a compressor, a straw works great for blowing dust out of dowel holes. I made sure to countersink the holes again to make it easier for the dowels to line up. Since this is so wide, I only have a few clamps that will actually fit, so it is good that I only have 3 joints to worry about. I added some coils to the worktop to help it glue up as straight and flat as possible. This slightly makes up for my earlier mistake of using a not square square. That does mean that some of the glue joints aren't fully closed, but they are closed at the top, and with the added strength of the dowels I have nothing to worry about. With the glue dry and cleaned up, I can now cut the worktop to its final dimensions. Since my track saw can only cut about 5 cm deep, I need to cut from both sides, and then finish the cut off with a handsaw. On the other side we are going to be installing the Moxon vise. To be able to attach the Moxon vise, we are going to make something called a breadboard end. This has 2 functions. First, it houses the threads for the Moxon vise screws, and second, it keeps to help the top flatter over the seasons. The breadboard end attaches with a very large mortise and tenon joint. To hug out the material for the tenon, we are going to do a bunch of cuts with the track saw, and then break the pieces out by hand. Lastly, we take a hand plane and a chisel to clean up the remaining wood, and then give it a light sanding. Let me show you why you should never put an auger bit in a drill press. Basically the tip of the auger is like a little screw to help it be pulled through the material when drilling by hand. But this also means that in a drill press it just sucks the material up.
Fuck me. No.
So after a little sadness I just milled up a new board and instead drilled a pilot hole straight through. This will help me keep mostly 90 degrees when drilling the rest out by hand. With the hole drilled, I can now mark out the position for the nut that will be our main thread for the vice screw. I simply set the router to the same depth as the screw and route out the material. This helps me get a consistent depth. Then I can clear out the rest of the material with a chisel. I'm using a Moxon Vice Kit for this, that I paid around £90 for. That includes 2 M20 thread rods, 4 washers, 4 nuts and 2 handles that thread on. The kit is designed to keep the screws in place using the nuts. By threading the handles you apply clamping pressure. but I want the screw to sit within the bench to save on space. So I need to alter the design up a little bit. You'll see me do this later. Now, do I recommend this kit? Absolutely not. For a very similar price you can just get 2 vise screws that are gonna run with way less hassle. They're gonna be easier to install and have a higher thread pitch, which means you have to do less turns to open or close the vise. The board that is going against the piece with the nut will have a washer routed flush to help distribute pressure, preventing the vise from pulling the nut out when clamping. Now for the mortise, we are going to use the same technique we used to make our template, but this time we're going to mark our blade position when fully extended on the fence. Now when we raise the blade, we know exactly how far it is going to cut on the underside of our board. After we cut the first side, we can simply rotate the board to get the rest of the material out, leaving only a small triangle that we can cut out by hand. Sadly, we won't be able to cut out the short side of the mortise with this technique, as the blade diameter is too large. I cut the mortise out of the 2 pieces separately, and then I will glue up the 3 pieces that make up the breadboard end later. This is a lot easier than trying to route out a huge mortise like this. The tenon is still oversized, so I have to cut off the ends. To help me get as straight a cut as possible, I cut part of it with the track saw and then finish off by hand. After a quick sanding, I can test fit the mortise and tenon. The mortise is cut a little wider to allow the top to expand along the width. Now I need to drill out material for where the vise screw is going to sit inside the bench top. If I had pre-planned, I could have saved myself £15 for the drill bit, by simply routing out the boards before glue up. I struggled quite a bit with making the screw run smoothly, but I got there in the end, and I glued all 3 boards together. So this is what I came up with at the end for the Moxon vise. So here's the top. In here, can we see that is a bolt glued in? So one of these is glued in right here, and then a washer is against it on this side to keep it from moving. And originally I was putting another one right in here to give it stabilization, but that was a nightmare to figure out. Then I screwed these onto here for stabilization. Also was horrible, so at the end I just got these washers, and I actually had to experiment around so much that there were so many holes around that I couldn't screw these in anymore. So I made a new little piece, screwed and glued it in, but now it's all running nicely. The breadboard end doesn't get attached with glue, as that would prevent the top from expanding freely. Instead it gets attached with another drawbore, making sure to oversize the holes along the width to allow for movement. Next we can work on the side pieces that we put aside earlier. I'm going to connect them to the breadboard ends using 2 dovetails. This not only looks pretty, but also gives them more mechanical strength, so they don't get pushed off when there's stress on the vise. To be honest, it's been a while since I cut my last dovetail. It's been a while since I did any kind of joinery. 5 years ago I finished my apprenticeship in Germany, and 4 years ago was the last time I worked as a joiner. Only now do I have the opportunity to get back into the craft. Something I struggle with a lot is the language barrier. My English is by no means the worst for a German guy, but I struggle with all the woodworking lingo and tool names. So if you hear me call something the wrong name, please correct me in the comments. I made a lot of small mistakes during this build, and I think a lot of it comes from me not being used to my shop. Back in Germany we had all the big professional machines, where you could simply type a measurement into the table saw, push a button and the fence would move on its own. This workbench was a great practice piece, and I feel a lot more confident in my abilities after completing it. When tracing dovetails I always like to use a knife. This gives you a groove in which you can place your saw, and it always gives you a perfect fit. Although this is a little easier on a hardwood with a tight end grain. To remove the material, I'm going to freehand with the router and try get as close as I can to the edge. Then, with the chisel, I go right up to the line and cut off the last little bit. Now the top 5mm are going to act like a template for going further down, and I can route out the rest with the template bit. Now I just have to remove the corners that the router can't reach into using a chisel, and we get a perfect fit. I'm putting a little chamfer on the edges of the dovetails. This should even out any small amounts of wood movement over the years, and it just looks good. With the breadboard ends complete, we can now glue up the last parts of the worktop. First we drive the dowels into the breadboard ends without applying any glue. I'm doing this from the bottom so the dowels won't be visible on the worktop. When gluing on the dovetail, I make sure to only apply glue to the dovetail pair on the front of the workbench and not the back, so that the other side can freely expand and contract. I don't have enough long clamps, so I have to resort to using some straps. Clamps would have worked much better. I always try to pick up as many clamps from boot markets as I can. They're dirt cheap there compared to new. After the glue is dry, I can just cut the ends of the dowels off. I left the breadboard ends a bit oversized, so I wouldn't have to be too exact with alignment. This now means that I have to trim the axes off with the hand plane. Next we are going to be working on the face vise. The hardware for this vise is a record number 53 vise I got used of Gumtree for £45. It has a quick release and opens about 40 cm excluding the chuck. This is bigger than anything I'll ever need to clamp, but I'd rather have a vise that is too big than one that is too small. What you see me doing here is the same principle I used for the dovetails. I first remove material close to the edge, then finished off with hand tools, giving me a template I can use to route out the rest of the material. Arguably, I could have probably just made a template, but in the time it takes me to make a template, attach the template, I would already be done doing it like this. If you have multiple things that you want to route out that are all the same, use a template. For one-off shapes, do it like this. I'm insetting the vise so that I can attach a piece of pine later, so don't use the hard metal jaws of the vise. The vise gets attached to the top using M10 bolts that go all the way through the workbench. I'm not taking my chances with a wobbly vise. Since the bolts are going all the way through, I need to drill some holes for the heads of the screws to sit. Later I'm going to close them up again using wooden plugs. I don't have a plug cutter, so I'm using a hole saw. When you do this, make sure to remove the centering bit and drill them using a drill press. Make sure to measure the outside diameter of the drill bit and the inside diameter of the hole saw for a plug that should fit. A little trick we learned when making dovetails is right when you glue them up to spray them with a little water. This will make them expand and hopefully close any joints that aren't perfect. If the joints are really bad though, as the wood dries and contracts again, it's going to make the wood split. Also, all the extra water makes the glue dry slower and weaker, so use this with caution. But for some plugs that are already almost perfectly fitting, it's just fine. I did match the grain direction, but to be honest, I didn't do the best job matching the color. But at the end of the day, this is going to be a workbench. And while it would be nice to be perfect and pretty, it won't affect the functionality. I'm making sure to attach the vise before gluing the top to the legs. As the vise weighs around 20 kg, and it would be a nightmare to try to do it upside down. Gluing the top to the legs was supposed to be easy, but here's where that tight-fitting tenon is a problem. It took me probably 40 minutes to get the tenon into the mortises, using a combination of pipe clamps and a rubber mallet. It took so long, in fact, that my camera ran out of battery. Most of the glue definitely dried on me, but that is fine, since I'm using another drawbore to connect the legs to the top. It was so hard to turn the pipe clamps at the end that I had to use a clamp as a lever to give me the leverage necessary to turn it further. Because of this extreme clamping pressure and me forgetting to put cords at the top to protect the wood, I now get to show you another trick for how to deal with a dent in wood. Using a spray bottle, a cloth and an iron. By wetting both the dent and the cloth using the bottle and then going over it with the hot iron, it forces steam into the wood fibers, which makes them expand. This only works though if the fibers aren't visibly broken and for smaller dents. This did enough for me though, as I still need to level the top. Since this bench probably weighs around 200 kilos, I can't move it around on my own. So I'm installing some workbench casters that are rated for up to 300 kilos. I got the kit from Amazon and I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in getting a pair. The casters are pretty easy to install and come with everything you need, including the template. Raising the casters is super simple. All you have to do is press the lever down with your foot and you can freely move the workbench around. And when you're done, you can lower them again and you have a workbench that won't budge. The best way to level the top is by having loads of money and having either a thicknesser or a drum sander wide enough and strong enough to put the heavy tabletop through in one go. The second best option is to use a sled for your router with a flattening bit. I have neither of these available to me, so I'm going to go with the third best option, elbow grease. Using a long hand plane, I can go over the entire top, first against the grain, then with the grain in an X pattern, and occasionally checking for any light shining through under the level. At the end I got the top almost perfect, with less than a millimeter of cupping in the center, and that is good enough for me. I give the tabletop a light sanding with 40 grit paper to even out most of the marks I made while planing. I'll be giving the whole workbench a proper sanding to 150 grit later before I apply the finish. I cut a piece to size that will cover the vise jaw. I left the thickness a bit oversized so I can plane it by hand to get the perfect thickness and a flush finish. The vise jaws are going to be 12 cm thick. They are so thick because I'm making them out of softwood, and the extra size helps distribute the clamping pressure evenly across the entire surface. Also, the extra size will make it easier to install some pop-up dogs later. After positioning the jaw correctly, I mark the metal jaw onto the wood so I can recess it. To be honest, this is the exact same technique that I did 2 times already in the video, so I won't bore you with it again. And there we go, all pretty and done, yay! I'm attaching them with the biggest screws I have, 6 by 100. They're just about short enough to not puncture through the jaw.
So I thought the vise was looking a bit too bulky, just like square like this. So first I thought maybe I just cut a bit off like here. But then I didn't love that shape, and then I just drew on like some circular shape, and I thought that might be nice. Take like a plate and then use that as my guide. And if I'm already making this corner like circular, maybe I'll add like a bit of a round over at the end here too.
I've not seen anyone put a big round over on all their workbench corners. I'm not sure if I'm losing functionality because of this, or if it won't be a problem. I was not able to think of any reason why this would be a bad idea, but you can let me know in the comments if it is a bad idea and why. I removed the bulk of the corner using my table saw. Using an angle grinder equipped with a cheap carving disc, I can go right up to the line on both sides. This leaves me with a hump in the middle that I can now even out until I get a square finish. This would have been a lot easier, quicker and more accurate using a 40 grit paper on an oscillating belt sander. I used the same process for the smaller corner, only here I used a hand saw instead of the table saw to remove the bulk. Now for something very scary that I still have to get used to, talking directly into the camera.
Next I want to install something not typically seen on Workbench. I have this machine that I had to buy while building my house or renovating, where I came into the issue of drilling through some steels, and it's this magnet drill. The way that this works is it's basically a drill press. But it's mobile, and down here has a very strong magnet which can attach to a steel beam. Still had some steel beams lying around in the yard, and I cut off this piece of steel, which then, careful with your fingers, don't get the fingers in between. If I put the steel on here and then turn it on, the steel is on here, and it's on here good. So what I want to do is I want to take the steel and I want to put it right here, embed it into the side, into the leg of the workbench, so that I can use this drill press to drill holes sideways into pieces.
Fine, you caught me. I'm making this whole video just so you can watch me recess stuff. But joking aside, this was actually a good bit of practice for me, controlling the router and getting used to hand tools again, which I will be needing in my future projects. But yeah, long story short, it works, it's parallel to the table, which is important, and I'll be making some jigs for it in the future, so stick around for that. To finish off the Moxon vise, I'm copying over the hole positions onto the chuck. I'm honestly just taking the piss here, freehanding the hole with an auger. I highly recommend using a Forstner bit and a drill press. It will leave you with a much cleaner hole, I just don't have one. To allow for clamping tapered pieces, you need to extend the hole by a couple millimeters across the horizontal. This will allow the chuck to slightly tilt without the screw biting into the wood. I do this by wiggling the bit side to side, which leaves a horrible finish. I recommend you use a Forstner bit and drill 2 holes next to each other, and then cut out the excess with a chisel. As I mentioned earlier, my kit is designed to have a static screw and have the handles move. But I want the screw and the handle to move together. So I'm drilling a 4.5mm hole through the handle and screw. Then I'm taking an M5 screw and screwing it in. This should hold the handle in place without any issues. Moxon vices have one big flaw: racking. That is when you only use the upper half of the vise jaws to clamp something. As you apply clamping pressure, the jaws become crooked and the pressure on the workpiece becomes uneven, giving the workpiece wiggle room at the top. To combat this, I'm going to copy exactly what Nick did. I'm cutting a groove into the underside of the table and then drilling out the rest of the material, as I can't reach with the router. Then I'm using a piece of wood to clamp a 10mm copper pipe into the groove. The best I could find without breaking the bank to put inside are some stainless steel rods. The stronger the material is that you are using here, the better it will be at combating the racking. Then I'm quickly routing out a recess for the rods to sit in, with enough space on either side for the chuck to rotate when clamping something tapered. I'm securing the rod to the chuck using a single screw to give the rod a pivot point. Next I'm going to be marking out all the holes I need to drill in the worktop. When measuring, I need to make sure that I have at least one square corner. For me, that is the corner of where the Moxon vise meets the front. I make sure to make all my measurements parallel to these 2 edges, so my dog holes end up square to each other. Another thing you should do when marking the holes is not to compound your measurements. So instead of marking out your first hole and then measuring 155mm from the hole to mark out your next hole, go back to the original edge and mark your second hole at 310mm. This way, if you make a small error somewhere along the way, you won't compound that mistake. The holes have a diameter of 19mm. This is a pretty common size for dog holes, and you will be able to find lots of accessories that will fit those dimensions. Sometimes going with the cheapest option is not going to give you the best result. Take this £3 spade bit I got off Amazon for example. Again, go with a Forstner bit or an auger for this. They just didn't have one long enough in the store I went to. I have the steel that I use when making pizza, but it works great to give the drill a solid base that I can clamp to the table. The holes that I'm drilling into the chuck do not go all the way through, as I will be making some pop-up bench dogs for them later. For drilling the side, I'm using the cheap spade bit, as it being bent doesn't matter as much when using a hand drill. With all the holes drilled, I can now make the pop-up dogs. You could definitely buy some, but I've already spent enough on this project and I'm trying to avoid sleeping on the sofa tonight. I originally made them round, but that put too much pressure in a small area, causing dents in the workpiece. So instead I'm milling up some scraps I have left from the table. By clamping my router, I make a quick makeshift router table, which is a lot easier than trying to run the router over the small squares. After a quick sanding, I can route out the space for the dogs to sit in. I'm using a template for this as I need to repeat this 5 more times across the table. To make the pop-up mechanism work, I'm using some cheap tip-ons that you simply drill in. I got a pack of 10 of these for £8, so less than £1 per piece. I'm using all 10 of them across the table. To get them sitting flush, I mark them using a knife and then cutting them at the Mitre Saw. Now I can give them a nice sanding and break all the edges. Since I already put a large round over on the corners of the worktop, I'm taking the biggest round over bit I have and rounding over the legs. I don't want to give a round over to the edges of the top though, so I need to stop just a little short. To round over the bit left over, I can use a rasp and some sandpaper. I both hate and love sanding. On the one hand, it takes ages and is extremely repetitive. On the other hand, it makes everything look pretty, and you finally get to see what you've been working so hard for. I sand all the way up to 150 grit, as that is what is recommended by the manufacturer of the hardworks oil I'm using. Since I don't want a large round over on the edges of the top, I just break them by hand using some sandpaper. Before applying the finish, I need to remove all the dust with a rag. The finish I'm using is Fiddy's Hardwax oil in satin. I'm using a foam roller to apply a thin layer over the entire table. This is probably most people's favorite part. Getting to see the grain pop is just so beautiful. When applying the finish, you need to make sure to get it everywhere, especially the bottom of the bench top, as otherwise the table will absorb moisture unevenly and become crooked over time. This also means if you put 2 coats on top, you need to do 2 coats on the bottom. While the first coat dries, I'm quickly gonna make some bench dogs that I can use in combination with the pop-up ones. I'm just using some plywood that I had lying around, as I can always replace these in the future if I don't like them. To connect the plywood to the dowel, I'm using a so-called wedged tenon. By cutting a slit in the top of the dowel and then driving a wedge into it, it expands the dowel, locking it into place. This is a technique often used with a hammer or an axe. To finish them off, I just give them a quick sanding. After the second coat is dry, there are only a few finishing touches left to do. I'm lining the vise jaws with some cork, as this will even out clamping pressure, give more grip, and because it is soft, it won't dent any workpieces. Even better would be some crubber. That is a cork and rubber mixture, but if I wanted to use that, it would have cost me about 10 times as much. The cork trims easy with a knife, and then can be sanded smooth. After cutting out the holes for the rods, I can now finally assemble the Moxon vise. The spray I'm using is a WD-40 silicone spray that helps the screws run smoother. And with that, the workbench is complete. While I have some beauty shots playing in the background that show a few of the clamping options, I want to thank you for finishing the video. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, as I plan to only get better with time. This was so much more effort than I could have expected. Not only did the construction of the bench take months, but editing and filming was a huge undertaking that I was not prepared for. Some might say putting over 100 hours into your first video is insane. But I want to give it my best, right from the start.